So let's say that we had stopped at this point and wanted to now, from these 30 statements, to select those that we wanted to have in our Q sample. This is where Fisher's ideas of experimental design were brought into, incorporated into Q methodology by Stevenson. Initially, he took a kind of probabilistic view about the composition of Q samples, but I think Fisher must have been at the University of London when Stevenson was, and I think also Pearson and Spearman and others. And so Stevenson was introduced to experimental design principles well in advance of American psychology, certainly. And one of the reasons I think that there seems to be so much emphasis on variance analysis in the study of behavior is because he became aware after he'd been here 3 or 4 years that they really didn't know about these ideas and how important they were. And so there's a lot more, I think, about variance analysis and experimental design in his book than he was really interested in. But it was because of this experience that he'd had of people not being aware of this. And in fact, if you go back to the psychology journals in the early 1950s, as opposed to now, it's all experimentation. But if you go back to the early 1950s, there's hardly any experimentation that's involved. So now, as far as theories that one might have, they may involve simply categories that seem to be latent within the concourse itself, just like in something like content analysis. You go through a text and a bunch of responses, and it looks like some people seem to be talking about this kind of thing, and some people seem to be talking about this kind of thing, so that there are maybe some technical issues in here about force versus free distribution, structured versus unstructured Q samples, more than one different idea in Q statements. These may be technical kinds of things associated with comprising a Q sort, administering a Q sort, and so forth. But if you start getting into quantum theory, the Q quantum connection, genuine versus ad hoc hypotheses, we may say, well, now we're getting over into philosophical and theoretical kinds of things. And so it may, in comprising a Q sample structure, it may consist of just going in and seeing what kinds of things seem to be inherent in the concourse, like technicalities, philosophical ideas, maybe some social things, meeting other colleagues and learning from them, maybe pedagogical things like how I can go about teaching this and relaying it to new audiences and those kinds of issues, so that we would have various categories that we could put these statements into ahead of time. Or one might have a theory about it, and what theory one has would probably depend on the kind of background you had. If you were, well, let's say a psychoanalyst, for example, maybe you have Karen Horney's views about the way people deal with anxiety. So you get something new like Q methodology and it creates a certain amount of anxiety. How do people deal with that? Some people deal with anxiety by moving toward it. They want to know more about it. Others deal with it by rejecting it. Presumably we wouldn't have very many people who were rejectors who would be in this room, so if we were wanting to get statements of that kind, we would have to broaden the base of the people who we were interviewing, who'd say it's such a foolish idea. And then, you know, Cattell effectively demolished all of that back in the 1950s, and all you're doing is continuing to obsess on this wild idea that there's something interesting about Q, and besides that you don't use large enough samples. I mean, it would not be hard to find a bunch of statements that would fit in on that side of it. Well, at any rate, one might have a theoretical kind of orientation so that these statements might represent some way in which a person is dealing with this idea, how they were reacting to it, as opposed to the contents of the idea themselves. There may be other theories about stages through which knowledge goes in becoming reliable knowledge. So there may be some kind of stage theory that I don't even know anything about, that these statements might reflect. Some of the technical ones, for example, may represent the earlier debates in the development of Q methodology and quantum theory and those kinds of things, referring to things later on. So one might put in different kinds of statements to represent the development of Q methodology as an idea system and have that in the Q sample structure itself. Well, I think here what we probably need to do is to condense this so that we don't have so many statements to deal with. And maybe initially we can just go through and perhaps select on the basis of something simple that's not really theoretical, like some statements that have to do with technical kind of features, things like structured versus unstructured Q samples, more than one idea in a Q statement, forced versus free distribution, and let's say that we let's include these three on that account. That we're going to, I don't have any place else to write here, but let me say that we're going to look for statements that have to do with more technical matters. Stevenson distinguished between Q technique, Q method, and Q methodology, and was interested primarily in Q methodology, and most of the interest in what he was doing was at the technical level as opposed to the broader methodological, so we might want to keep that distinction here. If we deal with the more methodological matters, and by which he meant the higher order philosophical issues, then we might look at things like number 27, not simply because the word methodological is in there, but Q as being something that is in the midst of a study, Q sorting, Q factor analysis, and all of that kind of thing. Within the context of dealing with a particular problem, it would be methodological in that sense, as opposed to being focused on some narrow aspect of Q technique itself. Interface between Q and philosophies of social science. And in fact, if knowing what audience we're going to be dealing with, that we have some people who are not social scientists as such, but in medicine and so forth, we might then want to edit a statement. Usually we edit as little as possible in order to keep it in the language of the audience that we're dealing with. And in this case, since the audience might be broader, we wouldn't want people disagreeing with that because they weren't interested in social science, social in particular. So by taking that out, both social scientists and non-social scientists could both agree with it or disagree with it because you've left it sort of blank as to what kind of science we're talking about. So if we included that and maybe something about, where was the thing about the Q quantum connection, and maybe the one about, where was the one about interbehaviorism? Is that 11? Yeah, with an interbehaviorism. So that would give us some methodological concerns represented. There were things having to do, let's say, with conceptual as opposed to methodological. I'm making all of this up as I go along, incidentally, so if anybody else, because we're sort of dealing with a problem in fast motion here. And with regard to conceptual issues, let's see, like, would something like using Q for mapping meaning might qualify? There was something about operancy. Where was that one? Number 14. Yeah, the operancy of factors. Does anybody else see a favored one that they might want to? This would be moving beyond a general knowledge of Q to confirm or disconfirm suspicions about Q methodology.
How about the art versus time?
Pardon? Art? Yep. That one was close to the end, as I recall. 23. All right. And then let's say maybe some special issues like intensive versus extensive. Special issues. Where was the intensive versus extensive? Which one? 15. Yes, right. Intensive versus extensive studies. Single case, we might not want to include that because intensive is very closely related to that. We want to avoid as much duplication as possible. And that's another important principle of Q-sample structure. That is, you're trying to create as broad, as conceptually broad and representative, that is representative of the complexity of the verbal environment as possible into a Q-sample in the same kind of way that a sample of respondents in survey research would represent the breadth and complexity of the population that it is representing. So if we came down to two statements like intensive versus extensive and single case, and we were needing to restrict the size of the Q-sample and therefore didn't want to include both of those because they were allied, we could either edit both of those and to incorporate them into a single item, or make a choice to include one or the other, because we would opt more for breadth, if at all possible, to have as much breadth as possible in the Q-sample. Let's see. And we might include, if we took the special issues there, extra Q things like appealing to new audiences, for example, pedagogical uses of Q methodology.
Number 7.
Something like number 7,
Learning more from colleagues.
learning more from colleagues. Okay. Let's see what we've got here at this point. Take a bit of an inventory. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, one more. Does somebody have interested?
The little thing is a couple of them around factors.
Yep.
Dealing with factors. Any one of them probably would do.
Like interpretation of factors?
Yeah.
That gives us 15. Recognizing that we might expand or contract the Q-sample to include some of these other things, we do need to keep it rather short. And if we went with these, we know that we've got some technical things in there, we've got conceptual, we've got methodological, we have some special issues. These categories and categories like this, whether they come from some theory or whether they just seem to be categories that are inherent in the concourse, provide us with a formula for guaranteeing to some extent that we're injecting some breadth into the Q-sample. When it's left to a person's, the investigator's own intuitions, well, I kind of like this statement, I'm interested in what people would do with this, then you're putting a Q-sample together that is, you would have some difficulty defending that as adequate in some kind of way, because you don't know exactly the kinds of principles that have gone into it. So this kind of forces a certain discipline on you at this particular point. It also makes things theoretically neat in the same kind of way that if you're wanting to know what is the difference between MDs and nurses with regard to the running of hospitals, you don't take a random sample of the population. You know, you go after physicians and nurses. Or if you're interested in different perspectives on the presidential election, you may go after Democrats and Republicans, and maybe Perot supporters, so that the PSAT that you have, the group of people, is focused. You've specifically gone out and looked for particular people who are apt to provide the factors that are there in the audience. So just as you would go after a specific kind of people who are theoretically saturated in some kind of way as more important than other people, similarly with regard to statements. You want to get statements in there that are nice and neat in the sense of being all focused on this particular topic, have all the various ingredients, things that are involved represented there, so that it represents then in the Q-sample the main aspects of what seemed to be going on in the concourse. Well, let's, you've numbered these. Now let's put the Q-sample number, and it's a good idea for the Q-sample numbers to be randomly assigned. I've seen some people get all their statements in categories. Here are all the statements that have to do with technical things, and here's the pack of statements that are conceptual, and they'll go through and label or number the first 3 statements, 1, 2, and 3, and they're all the technical ones, and then 4, 5, and 6 are the conceptual ones, and so forth. When they get done, their plan or their structure of the Q sample is built into the numbering system, so that it's quite possible as someone starts to Q sort the statements, they notice that they agree with statements 1, 2, and 3, but statements 13, 14, and 15 they disagree with, and they start becoming aware that there's some kind of connection between the numbers, and so they start looking at the statements as a kind of puzzle to solve rather than resonating with the content. So it's a good idea once you've gotten the statements to just completely randomize the numbering, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, so that there's no connection between the numbering and the statements. So if we went through here, we might want to, if you pull out these statements, 18, 19, 20, statement number 1, I'll go through them in order. Statement number 1, we picked out. Statement number 7 and 8 and 9, we've picked out. So that's 1, 7, 8, 9. Statement 11 and 14 and 15 and 18, 19, and 20. And 23 and 25 and 27, 29, and 30.
I think we're at an important enough point, Steve, that you better make sure we do this right, and I know mine is incorrect.
Yeah, we have 15. Yeah,
I know mine are, would you go through
Sure.
that order again fairly carefully?
Yes.
Which ones are in and which?
The ones that are in, these are the ones we want to include in the Q sample. Number 1, number 7 and 8, number 9, number 11, and number 14, and number 15, 18, 19, slowly, 15, 18, 19, and 20. 23 and 25. 27, 29, and 30.
So number 30 is number 15. Number 1
That's right.
is number 1.
So once you have them all in serial order, then renumber them in the upper right-hand corner, 1 through 15. All right?
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So,
Feel free to break in at any time.
When you were talking about the 4 areas that you just arbitrarily identified, if you had a theory ahead of time, would you look for the statements according to the theory, or would you look at your theory? Let's see, wait a minute, how am I trying to say this? Would the theory come first, and then you would identify statements, or would you look at the statements and say, aha, these do match my theory? There are statements in here which match my theory, therefore I will look at mine.
I think it might happen either way. I have a doctoral student right now, for example, who was looking through statements that he had gotten from an interview with someone, and was familiar with David Reisman's ideas of inner-directed, other-directed, and traditional-directed personality types, and concluded in looking through that these statements fit very nicely into those categories and decided to use that. Not that he was necessarily wedded to that, but that it fit very nicely, because ultimately these things do not matter so much. And ultimately, even if it was a theory as opposed to ad hoc categories that seem to sort of flow from the data, these become convenient devices. Stevenson was very clear about that, although a lot of people missed it, that even though he would start off with these categories that were sort of sponsored by and inspired by variance analytic conceptions, that the function of this structuring of the Q sample was over once it was structured and you got the Q sample. And that the factors that you eventually get out, which represent true categories of thought, take precedence over these.
Good.
Yeah.
My question really was going to follow into that. Aren't you making meaning ahead of time? But in fact, you just answered it.
Yes, yes. And it becomes quite clear when you interview people after they do the Q-sort that sometimes they have things in mind that bear scant relationship to the theory that motivated the study to start off with, or the structure of the statements. So, yes.
Is it a good idea to interview people after the Q-sort?
Yes.
Check on just that point to see if all their major ideas on this domain were raised and somehow able to be dealt with that Q-sort.
Yes, the ideal study, and actual studies fall short of that for various, sometimes practical reasons. You just cannot interview people, or people are not going to cooperate with you if I have to sit down for an interview because I don't have time, and so you say, well, would you do the Q-sort then and give me your score sheet tomorrow, or something like that. But the ideal study would be one in which you would interview people to find out what kinds of things they're actually saying, how they're actually thinking about something. Make the Q sample, comprise the Q sample from that verbiage, which is called discourse, concourse, a lot of these postmodern kinds of ideas fit hand in glove with Stevenson's ideas. To then give them the Q-sort. Since the Q-sort is standardized, and that's sort of forced onto everyone who participates, then you can sort of think of the Q-sort as a kind of skeleton, and the interview afterwards put a little bit of flesh on the bones and allow people to elaborate their own reasons for why they put these statements under +5 and -5, and give them an opportunity to elaborate. And it's important because oftentimes, well, I wouldn't say oftentimes, but sometimes you will get factors out after you factor analyze the data, and you'll put the statements out and just scratch your head and say, I just do not understand how these people on this factor are thinking. I don't understand the factor. Sometimes there's very good reasons for that, because if you do the Q-sort yourself, and I almost always do it when I'm doing a study, it may be I'm on factor B and all these people are on factor C, and there's one of the good reasons why I don't understand it, because I don't think the way they do, and that's demonstrable in the results. But nevertheless, one knows that it's a legitimate point of view, because here are 4 or 5 people over here that define the factor. They don't know one another, they didn't consult with one another, and yet they performed in such a way that the factor comes out loud and clear, the factor loadings are all very high, and so forth. Frequently, when you go back to the interviews, then afterwards, the interviews start clarifying what the character of the factor is, and all of a sudden it finally gets through to you as the investigator. Oh, so that's the way they're thinking. And then sometimes you go back to the factors and look, and it was there all along. You know, but now all of a sudden you can see it, so to speak, and before you just couldn't see it. I've had that happen many times. So the interviews are very helpful in that regard. Plus, they also provide a kind of test, if one is using the kind of the language of validity, they provide a kind of primitive test of the reality of the factors, because if the factor represents something, then there ought to be some kind of connection between what is being said in the factor and what's being said in the interviews surrounding the factor. They ought to fit hand in glove with one another. The factors are very useful, well, we'll get to that. The factors are very useful in showing which of the interviews are important to look at, because it may not have occurred to me that there was a factor C, and all of a sudden I see that there is a factor C. Furthermore, I see that respondent number 17, number 23, and number 48 are representatives, so it might never have occurred to me to have taken the interviews of those particular 3 or 4 people out to give them special attention, but now all of a sudden I become aware that they are birds of a feather. They think alike, and therefore I'm going to look at them as a group. That's getting a bit ahead of the story because we have to go through the factor analysis.